Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. Today, we're diving into the world of climate risk with Dr. Ron Dembo, founder and CEO of RiskThinking.AI. Climate risk is all about understanding how a changing climate will impact everything from the physical assets we build, like coastal real estate becoming vulnerable to rising sea levels, to the way that we grow food or power our cities. And unlike market risk, where we have decades of data to look back on, climate change is creating conditions that we've never really seen before, which means we need new ways of thinking about and modeling risk. RiskThinking.AI is tackling this problem with their Digital Earth platform. And what makes their approach unique is that they've developed the first stochastic or probability-based solution for measuring climate-related financial risk. So by integrating millions of data points from the locations of physical assets to different climate scenarios to insights from academics and experts around the world, RiskThinking is able to build models of the future to help people make better decisions. In my conversation with Dr. Dembo, we talk about how climate risk is reshaping global financial markets, RiskThinking's work with financial regulators, how better understanding climate risk can help actually accelerate our transition to a low carbon economy, and some of the barriers facing Canadian innovation. Dr. Dembo brings a really interesting perspective to these challenges, drawing from a fascinating career that spans mathematics, finance, and tech startups. If you want to learn more about RiskThinking and what they're building, you can actually check out their climate risk chatbot at ask.riskthinking.ai, where you can explore how climate change is impacting different companies, regions, and industries around the world. Let's get into it. Dr. Dembo, thanks for joining us.
It is a great pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. I'm very excited for this conversation. I have been diving into everything around climate risk for the past month, I would say, coming into this with knowing very little about it. So it's been super interesting seeing how, regulations are changing. Also had a chance to read your book, Risk Thinking, which was very informative. But I'd love to start with you and a bit about your background, because you have had a very interesting journey to where you are now. You founded several companies in the risk and the climate space. You've made some significant contributions to mathematics and finance. Yeah, could you start with maybe just sharing a bit about your journey so far and kind of what brought you to working on this problem?
Well, I guess I've always been a closet climate guy. My father is responsible for it. He would take me to the game reserve in South Africa about 5 times a year, which was very crude at that time. So you'd sort of sit in the dark in about 400 kilometers from the nearest light source. And so the skies were very beautiful. I don't know if you've ever seen the southern skies, particularly. They're very much more dense than northern. And, when you're far from any light source, you really see that sky. So we'd sit there and we'd listen to lions. We'd go out during the day and see elephants stampeding and spend the whole day watching a baboon family. So I've been, sort of hooked since, and had great opportunities, like standing for quite a while next to a lowland gorilla with a bunch of scientists, sort of swimming in Lake Tanganyika, which is 1,400 foot deep, and sort of wondering if I fell, how far I'd go, So I love nature.
And how did that kind of then translate into, you were teaching at Yale and kind of going into risk and finance, and now kind of full circle back to that kind of tree hugger origins?
It's the kind of thing that you're a tree hugger and then you think, well, I've got to get a job somehow. I became an academic and got a job at Yale and worked on sort of a passion of mine, which is mathematical optimization. And I was sort of in the computer science department as well. And we were there at the very, very beginning of AI, before you could actually do anything with it. So that was a wonderful time. And just by chance, I took a summer job consulting to Goldman Sachs and suddenly discovered that there's actually life after academe. I was had a wonderful time in Goldman Sachs when they'd hired about 40 very senior academics, some of the best academics in the world. So I was sitting in probably the best university in the world at Goldman Sachs. And the summer job extended to about a year. And then, while I was there, I learned about finance. I didn't know anything about finance. Finance was dirty for me when I was a kid. Played with some very interesting mathematical problems, did some really good work there, and came back and moved to Canada for family reasons and decided to start a company to do something I thought was really necessary for Goldman Sachs, which was enterprise risk. They couldn't really look across the entire enterprise. And there was no enterprise risk at that time. There were no chief risk officers. There was nothing like that. And so naively, I set up a little company in my backyard and bootstrapped it pretty much the whole way till I sold it. It was sold to Fitch and then IBM. And it was a company with 850 people by the time we finished. Went through a full cycle of development and growth. It was also in a period when, if you went to a bank and you said, I'm looking for funding, they'd say, well, what collateral do you have? Like, what do you mean what collateral? It's in my head, And today you wouldn't have that problem, but there were no funds at that time. It grew right to being the largest private software company in Canada, which, I found kind of amazing. Like I never thought I'd do that.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I guess that was kind of pre or kind of right at the beginning of venture capital kind of coming onto the scene in a big way, much more limited options in terms of getting things off the ground and finding funding and all of that.
So once I finished, I actually spent a lot of time with TED people. Actually, went to the Galapagos with some scientists and really started to work on my passion, which was climate. And at that time, I thought, well, the best thing I could do is get companies to reduce their carbon footprint. That was way too early. It was even pre-Al Gore. And then I thought the best thing I could do is get them to retrofit buildings because they were going to need to do that to mitigate climate risk. But that was way too early. Anyway, that all led to Zerofootprint, which was the company, to RiskThinking. And RiskThinking is the culmination of all of that, the enterprise risk software and climate.
That's a really interesting story. So maybe we could talk about RiskThinking now. Can you share a bit about, what the company does and kind of what problem it's solving for which customers?
So what the company does is build what's called the digital twin, which is a future representation of the world digitally that deals with a certain problem, in this case, climate. So representing what our future climate might look like worldwide and using and developing the tools that you need to actually mine that to be able to measure climate financial risk, to reprice climate markets that are mispriced because they don't take climate risk into account. But we built the infrastructure to do that. And that's a massive project, actually. It's the kind of thing that could never have been done more than a few years ago because of all the actual mega improvements in data processing and data storage. It's been an incredible journey. And now we have a very mature digital twin. So it's kind of fascinating to see how I can go to this digital twin and ask it a question that involves 600 million stress tests and looks at 1 million different locations in the Earth's surface and involves hundreds of companies. And I can do that in 30 seconds. And I think, wow, you could never have done that before.
Yeah. So digital twin, I've seen that more in kind of the building space where you're looking at, a digital representation of a building. But to do that for the Earth, a huge amount of data, huge amount of, I would imagine, variables kind of interacting with each other. So is it kind of a visualized representation of the world, or sort of like, if I'm a hotel chain, I can get data on my locations? Like, what does it kind of look like for the user?
So for the users, it looks very simple, actually. It's really show me where all my physical assets are. I mean, now that might sound strange. Like, companies up till now have been measured only on their financial performance and the people that run them and so on. But no one's ever had to look at the physical assets that they own, the airports, the pipelines, the water desalination plants, the solar power plants all over the world. And you now need to know those. And the reason is really simple. When climate change hits and, we get more cyclones and stronger rainstorms and so on, they hit your physical assets. And they've never been measured or don't enter into a calculation of how good this company is. So imagine two companies. Imagine FedEx and, a company that's very similar to FedEx. The only difference is, of course, that they have their locations are different. The kind of cars they use are different. Some of them lease, some of them own. So imagine one is much more climate sensitive than the other. In other words, one is much more susceptible to climate impacts than the other. Guess what? Which would you rather, all the other things being equal, which would you rather use? I mean, they all have a similar pricing. They all do the same things. They all fly aeroplanes and all that. But, one might be carbon neutral, the other might not be. One might have, great mitigation of all the climate risks it face, the other might not. So knowing that is really important today, because if markets price those companies according to how well they perform climate-wise and financial-wise, if those prices were reflected back to a user, that would affect behavior. People would, all other things being equal, I think people would gravitate towards the more climate-friendly option.
Yeah, right. Because then right now, all of that future risk is essentially not showing up on the balance sheet. It's not showing up in decision making. So it sounds like there's some parallels between kind of like scope 1, 2, 3 reporting, which tries to bring in some of those externalities into a company, but this is doing it from a future risk perspective, almost like translating that scope 1, 2, 3 into how exposed are you as a company?
Well, think of it. The companies are valued largely on how well they perform financially and their risks, their credit ratings. So imagine if you paid a price for your climate risk and it was heavy, your credit rating would drop. It would be more expensive for you to borrow money. Your profits would go down. Yeah, so guess what? You'd change your behavior pretty quickly.
Right. It's probably helpful to kind of define what climate risk is. We talked a little bit about some of the physical risks, talked a little bit about some of, I think, what's called transition risk of, how much carbon is in your supply chain. But yeah, maybe you could kind of help us level set on what does climate risk mean and what does that entail?
Climate risk is really sort of a risk that we're now taking note of. What it is really the variability in our climate is having an impact, a financial impact on countries, on companies, on people. For example, the number of hot days in Boise, Idaho is going to treble in the next few years. Guess what? Anyone working outside will not be able to work outside as much as they did before. There'll be parts of India where it'll be impossible to work outside. The temperatures will be too high. There'll be drought where you used to have rain. There'll be rain where you used to have drought. Saskatchewan might not be able to produce wheat anymore. So Canada will be affected. The fish might move because the waters are warming. So there's all sorts of impacts that a climate could have that are not measured today when you look at credit ratings. Canada's credit rating, or, IKEA's credit rating, takes into account its climate. It should take into account its climate behavior.
What impact does that change to a credit rating have on a country or a company?
Well, imagine if I knew that we would no longer be able to mine the tar sands because it would be a stranded asset. In other words, it'll be so much more expensive to take oil out of the ground than it could be sold for in the market. And imagine simultaneously I could no longer grow wheat in Saskatchewan, or I could no longer fish off Nova Scotia. Canada would take a big beating. There'd be a lot of jobs lost, a lot of unemployment. there'd also be costs. There'd be lack of revenue from those sources, which are our main sources of revenue. Imagine if our forests burn and we can't sell wood. A country like Canada is exposed in the sense that in the future, climate might impact all of that. So when I'm looking to the credit rating of Canada, I would say, look, there's a certain chance that Canada is going to get hit badly. So I'm not going to give it a high credit rating. So Canada has to spend more money on borrowing. That increases costs for Canadians. It cuts down on government ability to spend. So it really echoes right through the whole economy.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And similar experience for a company. It increases borrowing costs, and people are less excited about your future. I feel like sometimes there's an emphasis on the physical risk side. Could you talk about how the transition risks interact with that?
Imagine we want to move from a country that is very heavily impacted by burning fossil fuels, the way we might generate electricity, the way we might drive, transportation sector, the heating of buildings, and so on. Imagine we want to move to an all-electric world, and one which has only, renewable energy. Well, we'd have to change a lot of what we do, right? You'd have to get rid of all the oil-fired heating in all the houses. You'd have to get rid of all the gas heating in houses. You'd have to get rid of cars that burn gas. So there's a transition that would take place. So, for example, in Canada's transition, there might be no more gas cars sold after 2035. So you imagine there's a path forward to get to that point. We can't just suddenly turn a switch and become carbon neutral. And so that transition involves changes in infrastructure, spending on those changes in infrastructure. It also might involve doing things to mitigate climate risk. For example, if we see that we can't fish anymore on the East Coast, maybe we can fish on the West Coast. If we see that we can't grow wheat in Saskatchewan, we might want to build other industries that would replace that. We might want to hedge by doing other things that, creating new industries, putting more money into AI, So those things are transitions. And a transition will affect physical, because as I transition to this new economy, I'm going to have different assets. So I must have sold some and bought some new ones. I sold the gas generators and I'm buying solar power plants, that kind of thing. Or I'm moving to EVs, so I have to have electric generation everywhere. That didn't exist before. I'll need a different grid because our grid won't operate if we distribute energy. All of that's called a transition. And as you transition to the future, there are costs, there are benefits, there's, one has to evaluate that. So transition risk and physical risk are quite linked. A transition might impact physical.
Right. And so if you're, I don't know, let's say Walmart, the heat might affect your refrigerated trucks, but you also need to think about if all my trucks today are internal combustion, but in the future will need to be electric.
Need to be electric, yeah. So you've noticed FedEx is moving to electric trucks. And, that costs money. And that changes where you buy fuel and what fuel you buy. And it has great benefits in some sense that you do less maintenance on those trucks because they don't require it anymore. But you have to put up the capital to buy them or lease them.
And so does having a better risk or a better understanding of climate risk, it seems like that then helps companies like a FedEx create a financial case and a financial picture for that transition of their fleet, not just driven by, let's say, like a net zero goal or altruism, but also by an understanding of kind of the future that they can then communicate to shareholders.
Yeah. Now imagine it's 1914 and you're using horses to pull carriages, right? And you want to try and build faster horses and breed them? Or would you like to believe that you're seeing these cars come off a production line? Maybe cars are going to take over from horses. Now, if you put your head in the sand and say, no, I'm just going to try and get my horses to run faster, you will not be competitive. And think of it, Canada stuck its head in the ground on renewables. So guess what? We're not competitive with China in terms of production of solar. The United States didn't push solar. So now even EVs, the biggest exporter and biggest buyer of EVs in the world are the Chinese. And they're going to own the car industry of the future. They will dominate it. And it's because we didn't take account of that transition. So you can see the future at times. When the first Tesla came out, you know that the future is going to be EV. So what are you waiting for? When you see solar power come out and its price dropping quite significantly, and you are stuck with the problem of a lot of carbon in your economy, what's to stop you moving to EVs? So you do it in a way it's not punitive to the economy, but you know that's the direction you have to go in. If not, you put your head in the sand and you wake up and you're not competitive.
And that's a different mindset around risk. It's more about looking around corners than...
I'll give you a really good example, and this is a personal one. In 2009, 2010, it was obvious to me that we would have to retrofit buildings. Why? Because our building stock that you look around and see would not change between now and 2050. I mean, the 90% of the buildings you see now will still be here, but they're not built for a climate change. They're not built to, they're not well insulated necessarily. They're using poor generating and heating stuff. There'd be a real necessity to retrofit them. And so I made a proposition to the government here in Ontario, put up $1 million for a worldwide prize on retrofitting buildings. Why? Because we have just the groups of people you need to do that really well. And we could build an industry in that and carry it out to the world. Today, it's a massive industry. It's in the hundreds of billions retrofitting. Every city has to do it. Every country has to do it. And we're spending a lot of money on it. I couldn't get them to do it. So I actually put up my own money, started a competition, and we ran the world's first reskinning prize, we called it, retrofitting buildings. And the problem with retrofitting wasn't that you didn't go to some architect and get some mega project to retrofit a building and it was a one-off. You needed to build a system where you could retrofit buildings while people still lived in them. You needed a methodology. So I put out this competition to find the best methodology for doing this. And we got a ton of applications. We gave 10 prizes out, which are just, this is winner number 1, number 2, etc. And we did it for 2 years. And in fact, people would come to me and say, well, could you retrofit my building? And I'm, what do I know about that? We could have been the world's retrofitter. And for $1 million investment, guess what? We didn't do it.
Right. So we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I want to maybe put a pin on that and come back to it, because I'd like to understand from your perspective, just pulling further on the climate risk. Large institutions have risk management teams. They do risk all day, but climate risk is unique from that. And again, you wrote about this a lot in your book, Risk Thinking. It's fundamentally different. And a lot of the ways that currently risk is handled is looking back at the past. But yeah, I would love to kind of hear from you, what is different about climate risk compared to what we've been doing?
So think of the financial markets. You've got a ton of data. You've got S&P values minute by minute for the last, ever since S&P came about. You've got enormous time series of every stock, of every bond. So there's a ton of past data. And the typical time frame for making decisions is very short. When you're trading, it's microseconds. When making investments, it's, maybe days, months, but it's short, relatively. So that backward-looking data is actually relatively relevant. It's not the only thing you should use, because you have big crashes that happen, and you need to take them. Those are what are called tail risk. And that's where forward-looking information comes out. But predominantly, you can get away with backward-looking. But come climate, and climate has long horizons. If in the next 10 years, the North Atlantic current shifts, we're going to have massive changes in weather, but they won't happen, from Monday to Tuesday. They'll happen over years. So fundamentally, you're looking at future problems where it depends on future values, which are inherently uncertain. If I'm investing in solar, how do I know what the price of electricity is going to be like in the future? Or how do I know how expensive gas might be? Or how do I know whether wind will be much cheaper than solar? There's a lot of uncertainty. So, the difference is that climate is inherently what's called radically uncertain, and you need forward-looking data. So where do you get data that's never happened before? You get it from models, you get it from thought leaders, you get it from the wisdom of experts. But of course, because it's uncertain, you can't say the sea level rise in Halifax Harbour will be 2.4 inches in 2050. If you said that, no one would believe you. But if you said that it's going to be somewhere between 2.4 inches and 3 feet, with more likely 3 feet, that's more appropriate as an answer. That's like a stochastic or a uncertainty answer to an uncertain question. So if I've got uncertainty, deep uncertainty about something, I can't expect to have a deterministic, that is a single point solution to it. Here's a great example of uncertainty. Imagine it's 2018 and it's September, and the Bank of Canada is making forecasts which are going to influence the budget and how we spend money in Canada. So they have to forecast typically for 6 months, and they say, the GDP is now 2.4. It'll be 2.4 next March. Guess what it was in March 2019? 0.4. Now, imagine the budget that we built based on a 2.4 GDP versus what things are going to cost if it's a 0.4 and where prices will go, what will happen. It's radical. And so, governments have a great little hedge for that. They just print money. So we get inflation. But you see the point that I'm making is that you can't predict those kinds of things. So you need a different way of analyzing them. And that's the big difference with climate, where there is no good story for prices in 2050.
Yeah. And if you were to take that uncertainty approach to the Bank of Canada example, you might have said it could be between 0.4 and 3 with a higher likelihood of 0.5 or something, and you might have been closer rather than taking an average.
So you might ask the question, what would you do? What should they have done? Well, the way you deal with that is what they call hedging in the financial world. So in other words, you'd say, look, I don't know, 0.4 looks really kind of low to me. But if it were 0.4, we would really be hit very badly. So why don't we hedge that? So what we'll do is hedge our bets on what we're going to put into the budget until we get closer to that time when we make that prediction better. Another example might be Singapore will be underwater unless they do something about keeping water out of Singapore with rising seas. How high should they build the wall? Some scientists are saying it could be 20 feet. Some scientists are saying it's only going to be 3 feet. So imagine you just built a 3-foot wall and it was too small. The downside is extremely high. We've seen that in New York City. So the hedge is build a wall that's extendable so that as you get closer to that time, you will know that there's much more chance of it going up to 20 feet and you'll start extending it. It's more expensive to do that, hence the cost of the hedge, but it's much more expensive to, get swamped. So, that's the kind of analysis you need to do. So in a world that's random or uncertain, the nature of a solution is really an action. You're doing something, I'm going to build that wall, but you hedge at the same time.
And so if I have it correctly, that's the difference where deterministic is it will be 2.4 and we're going to assume a linear line will reach that, whereas stochastic is there are many outcomes and we're going to plan based on the potential for those different outcomes. And that's where actions like hedging come in.
Yes. So you'll always, in that uncertain world, the natural thing is, what's the hedge? So imagine I'm driving a Tesla to Montreal. Let's say I've got a 600-kilometer range. So if all is well and the conditions are perfect, I'll get there. But what if I hit really cold weather and I notice that my car is actually using more electricity than it should? I might hedge by going to stop and get my batteries filled so that I don't have that problem.
Gotcha. So I want to talk a little bit about your work with the financial superintendent and financial system in Canada, but maybe like just as a quick zoom out, if this type of thinking was applied, let's just say in like financial institutions, financial markets, what do you think would be the biggest change in behavior and outcomes for climate?
Well, for one thing, we would be saying to ourselves back in 2010, it might be that we're going to need to retrofit our buildings. It might be that we won't be able to generate revenue from oil. It might be that we need to develop other alternative sources of revenue. So the hedging would be to invest more money in less money in the tar sands and more money in AI, let's say. So, Canada invented AI, essentially. Our Nobel Prize winner is out there getting his Nobel Prize today, I think. It happened, and he was my neighbor in computer science in University of Toronto. I know him. And we've got some very good research institutions. We do some good AI here. But guess where OpenAI or ChatGPT was developed? It wasn't in Canada. Guess who's making most money from AI today? Guess where NVIDIA built its chips? Think of what would have happened to Google had it been invented in Toronto. So that's an interesting thought.
Yeah. I think this is a part of the conversation, particularly around energy in Canada, that is not happening enough. There's a lot that is very much, we need to protect what we have. We need to be the oil producer for the future, an uncertain future. This is the economic engine of Canada, always has been and needs to be in the future. And it's a black box around what could happen. It's kind of just writing off climate's not a thing.
Yeah, we are building an economy. Think of Alberta. Alberta stopped wind farms. They spent money to stop wind farms. Ontario spent money to get rid of wind generation capability. We're digging up bike lanes. We are not really building an electronic infrastructure that's adequate for a move to EVs. But it's on the rise. You can see it. There are more EVs sold than regular cars in China today. It's the largest exporter of cars today in the world. It went from zero to being the largest exporter of cars, while General Motors and Ford and that gently sleep.
Yeah. So maybe on a more optimistic note, we can talk about your work with OSFI and the Office Superintendent of Financial Institutions. It seems like an institution that is willing to try some things, willing to kind of be a leader in this space. Could you talk a bit about the work that you've done with OSFI, maybe even some of the regulations that they're bringing in for financial institutions, and some of specifically, I think, the work you did with scenario analysis there?
Yeah. Well, OSFI is, and the people we work with at OSFI, the climate change people, are a real exception amongst regulators. They are truly innovative and entrepreneurial. I mean, entrepreneurial regulators are not the norm. And they have vision. They don't have necessarily all the tools and data that they need. So how can they get it? And their vision and our vision kind of coincide. We say we really want to be the supplier of those tools in Canada. So they went around looking for all sorts of companies that could supply them with data and help them with technology. And eventually they found us. But moreover, we were prepared to do it with them, in effect, pro bono, with the understanding, in a sense, that we would get some visibility amongst the people that they're regulating. And so that's the quid pro quo. They're a very good partner of ours, and we're a good partner of theirs. I think we do well with them. It's a very good relationship and very unusual one. I don't think there's another one like this in the industry that around the world. I don't know of anything like it. So we have the wherewithal, for example, to do things that they don't have tools to do today easily. Like, for example, the central banks and the regulators often have all of the data on banks at hand, but may not have the tools to be able to actually evaluate. So let me give you an example. I'll give it to you I'll try and stay away from us because I don't want to break any agreements we might have. But we also talked to the New York Fed, which is the Federal Reserve that makes a lot of the decisions in the US. They recently did a stress test of all the banks in the US, the major banks. There were 21 banks, people like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and they gave them a stress test. They said, here's an event. You tell me how you would measure that event in your bank today. And they all failed. All of them actually used the top consultants in the world. You can name them. I mean, I don't want to name them, but it's all the very big names to help them with that exercise. They all failed. And primarily they failed because they were using past data and deterministic assumptions and so on. So when we spoke to the New York Fed, they asked us a question. They said, if we gave you all of the US loans, so imagine a snapshot of all of the US, all loans, all mortgages, everything, would you be able to model that and actually measure it in your system? And we said, yes, because in that case, we have a way of benchmarking what they're giving us. How good is it? And so that's the kind of thing we can do here. We haven't done that in the New York Fed. I hope one day we do. But that's the problem we have. So in climate, what we have is the following challenge. The governments, our government, Ontario Infrastructure, Ontario Health, do not have the tools to be able to understand the full impacts of climate. And the municipalities in Canada do not have that, the big cities. They have some, but they don't have the ability to really look at the city in its future in the stochastic way that we talked about. So imagine if someone paid for it. Some philanthropist said, you know what, risk thinking, give your software and data to everybody and we'll pay for it. Fantastic, we'll do that in a heartbeat. And suddenly every regulator, every city, every municipality, every government has data and tools that enable measurement. And by the way, because they would be using the same data sources and that, you could aggregate it across the country and you'd have a map of all of Canada, a digital twin of Canada. In other words, you have a digital story for Canada's climate future. Imagine. It's such a small thing in a way, yet it hasn't happened.
And I imagine every municipality or province is sitting on a mountain of data, the ability to analyze it, but then to do the kind of stochastic analysis, like you're sitting on this resource you can't convert it.
The good news, and I had this as a comment today when I had a venture capitalist talking to me. He said, I'm just amazed. I look at this, you got 600 million stress tests and 5 million locations, and I'm looking at this in 30 seconds. There is something that I would suggest to you. It's totally open source about it. It's called Ask RiskThinking. It's ask.riskthinking.ai. And you can go to it and say, what are the top 5 companies in the S&P 500 in 2050? What do you think they'll be? And what do you think the worst companies in Canada will look like in the TSX? And it'll answer you. It can answer much more complex questions as well. So we put it out there because it just gives a taste of what we could do.
Yeah. I spent some time with it, and it's kind of mind-blowing looking at who's most exposed, what are the companies or regions that are most exposed by these dimensions, and it just comes back with the data like basically right away. It's pretty incredible, and to do that kind of analysis on that like quickly is just, it's pretty mind-blowing.
What's truly mind-blowing is the quantity of computation that's needed to do that. I mean, it's not unlike when you make a query to Google or ChatGPT, you have hundreds of thousands of computers being fired up, and you get the thing back in microseconds, and an enormous amount of compute power is used.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing, when you're talking to OSFI and working with the financial institutions, I feel like there's some of it is risk, but also just we've done it this way before, like kind of that hesitation to change, like the kind of corporate inertia. Were there any big kind of aha moments that you saw going through that? I read one of the kind of outcome reports, and some of the banks were like, it was much harder to do this than we expected, but also much more eye-opening than they expected.
I guess the biggest aha we've seen is the people who are looking at this kind of thing have just not been trained to think in a stochastic world, in a world of uncertainty. And so they are at a bit of a loss. What data should I keep? What should the answer look like? What I even collect? What should my product look like? There's a sense in banking, we know how to do this. We've had scenarios before, but the reality is there's one thing about what if scenarios, what if this happens, then that, versus a stochastic view, which is what the weather people do. They will not tell you that it's going to rain on Tuesday. They'll say 40% chance of rain. And guess what? As it gets closer to Tuesday, they change that percentage.
Right. And that's the kind of hedging that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you get your umbrella out if I told you there's a 90% chance next Tuesday? No, I'll wait till Monday before I buy. And let's say I haven't got an umbrella, I'll buy one.
Right. But if the cost of umbrellas was going to be high on Monday, I might hedge a little bit earlier, just in case. Right.
That's cost-benefit analysis of hedging.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That makes sense. Like a whole industry is grown up thinking one way, and now the way of thinking needs to change.
It's like we speak ancient Greek and they speak modern Italian, and we don't understand each other.
Yeah. So the last big question I wanted to ask was related to the conversation we had before around the need for vision in Canada, particularly when it comes to climate. You've been in the space for a while. Can you share your thoughts on what's missing at the macro or vision level? You talked about the retrofit prize, which is a great example of leverage. But yeah, I would just love to hear your thoughts on zooming out to that vision level for Canada.
Well, one thing that's certain things about the future you can see already. I mean, it's absolutely patently obvious that EVs will probably dominate the future. So, what are we waiting for? It's patently obvious that our buildings will need to get retrofit because we won't be able to afford to put people in a public housing where the cost of heating will be astronomical. It's patently obvious that we're going to have a lot of trouble selling oil in the future, and we might as well think of how we re-engineer ourselves. It's patently obvious that AI is going to play a massive role. That we've got great institutions. Why not build on them more? Why not take the real great institutions and subsidize them more? It's patently obvious that we got certain strengths. We have a very good construction industry. We have very good metallurgical industry. We have very good scientists in many domains. We have very good AI people. We should be the owners of AI products. We shouldn't be just the buyers of it or the inventors that other people take and make money with. So, I think a lot of the future is obvious. And, I think there's a lack of understanding of how to really make that happen.
Yeah. A lot of the conversations I've had on this topic tend to skew towards more capital with a higher risk appetite. From your perspective, what are some of the things that you think need to change to take advantage of this kind of obvious future and go for it?
I think the biggest thing we're missing in Canada is helping our own Canadian companies. And we don't need charity. Most of the companies are good. They innovate well. They're smart. They don't need charity. They need buyers. And we should be the buyers of our small companies' products. We should be the buyers of first resource. We should help them get over that chasm where, they've got to have buyers. We do just the opposite, actually. A government department here will buy a tool from the US before it'll buy it from a Canadian company. That's not the case in the US. In the US, there's a tremendous effort to foster companies by being the buyer of first resource. You don't want to provide charity to companies because they will never learn to innovate. But you do want to help them get over that point that, where they've innovated and now they need markets. And, we just had an example here of a company, a bank, buying a much inferior product to ours and never having talked to us about it. I can understand ultimately they might decide that that's a much better mousetrap than ours. But it's a well-known inferior product. And they didn't even consider us in the purchase. That's crazy. That's what hurts Canada. And that's why our companies land up being bought by the United States, because we're good innovators and then we sort of, other people lift off our innovation.
Yeah. Yeah. Something I've heard too is, Canadian corporates kind of looking at, well, what if companies in the US bought, and we'll just go with what they kind of want to see that proven. Let the US de-risk it, then we'll be your buyer.
There's a pride in mediocrity here. There's a pride of being the second purchaser. Oh, we don't want to be the first. How many times have you heard that? Like, our major banks are very wealthy. They are very well protected. They have enormous earnings, but we don't want to be the first. Are you kidding me? I mean, you should be the first. You should be actually really fostering innovation here, not killing it. I'm speaking from the heart. It's honest. I don't like covering things up. This is, I love this place, and, I'm an immigrant here and we have a good life here. But boy, a lot of things happen here despite the surroundings rather than because of the surroundings.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been great. I want to maybe just close with a quick rapid fire, some nice, easy questions to close us off. What's something you're excited about in the year ahead?
I think we're going to see a massive amount of innovation, primarily because of generative AI. It's absolutely patently clear that it's going to make a massive change to our societies, and that it also needs regulation because it could go awry. I think we should be doubling down on AI. We've got good AI here. We should be doubling down on it. I think we should be taking climate change very seriously because Canada is very exposed.
Yeah. That's great. What's a book, podcast, movie that you would recommend for folks listening?
There are a few books out there. I can't sort of think of an obvious one. There's a new book called Nexus that really gives you a sense of what the future might be. I remember very vividly when the first PC came out and people were debating, will every home have a PC? Well, how many PCs do you have at home? So, I think we can see a lot about what's changing. Gen AI will have the same effect as the internet had. Within 8 years, you will see a very different world. So we better become leaders in it, not
great.
laggards.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned Nexus. That's the book my fiance got me for my birthday this year, and it's sitting on the top of my to-read list, so I'll have to crack that one open. Any advice for first-time founders or folks that are just coming into this space?
Don't give up. Yeah, sometimes it feels like a major struggle, but, have a vision and, be prepared to pivot often. And don't think of that as a bad thing. Think of it as a positive thing. But being an entrepreneur is don't give up.
That's great. And I think that's part of what Canada needs a little bit more too of is it's totally fail, find the next thing, keep pivoting and being comfortable with that. We need a lot of that as well.
Yeah, we should embrace failure rather than fear it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to leave off. Ron, thanks so much for your time. This is a fantastic conversation, very enlightening. Really appreciate you coming on the pod.
Thanks. And it's really impressed with your questions. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.